The message on my phone changed everything. It wasn't a text, not really. It was a notification from our shared cloud storage, the one David insisted we use for transparency. A new audio file had appeared, uploaded just minutes before, titled something innocuous like Project Notes Tuesday. But the timestamp was late Monday night, long after David was supposedly asleep. Curiosity, that quiet, insidious thing, prompted me to tap it open. My hands were slightly damp as I held the phone, the cool glass pressing against my palm. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pregnant with unspoken things. David was out, at some late meeting, or so he'd said. The audio started. Low, hushed voices. At first I couldn't make it out, just a murmur. Then, David's voice. Distinct. A little too soft. A little too careful. Just a few more weeks, Sarah. I promise. It's all falling into place. A woman's laugh, light, airy, completely unfamiliar, followed by her voice, equally low. You've been promising that for months, David. Are you sure she suspects nothing? My breath hitched. Suspects nothing? She? Me? The world tilted slightly on its axis. David's reply was a sigh, then that careful whisper again. She's preoccupied with her own things. She barely notices anything anymore. Preoccupied? Barely notices anything? The words felt like tiny shards of glass, lodging themselves under my skin. I wasn't just hearing a betrayal. I was hearing his perception of me. Invisible. Distracted. A non-entity in my own life. The woman, Sarah, chuckled again. Good. Keep it that way. We can't afford any complications. Not now. Complications. That was me. I was the complication. The audio ended abruptly. The silence in the house roared. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I stared at the phone, the screen a cold, bright rectangle in the dim room. My fingers were numb. I didn't cry. Not then. The shock was too profound, too absolute. It wasn't just the affair. The idea had, in fleeting, unwelcome moments, crossed my mind over the past year of David's increasing distance, his late nights, his guarded phone calls. No, what truly gutted me was the casual dismissal in his voice, the way he painted me as someone so utterly disconnected, so easy to deceive. It was the quiet contempt, the feeling of being erased. I stood there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the weight of the revelation settling over me like a shroud. The air felt thick, difficult to breathe. The familiar scent of our home, a mix of stale coffee, the faint perfume from the living room diffuser, and something vaguely metallic from the kitchen, suddenly felt alien, tainted. My mind raced, replaying months of subtle cues I had dismissed. The way he flinched when I touched his arm unexpectedly, the passwords on his phone that changed overnight, the sudden interest in his appearance after years of neglecting it, the vague answers to simple questions about his day. I had attributed it to stress at work, to the pressures of his promotion, to anything but this. Because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. He was my husband, my partner of 15 years. We had built a life together, brick by brick. Or so I thought. The phrase from the audio echoed, "She barely notices anything anymore." It was a lie, but it was also a reflection of how he wanted to see me, how he needed to see me to justify his actions. A wife so oblivious, so lost in her own world, that betraying her was almost easy, convenient. It was a narrative he had constructed and perhaps, over time, had even come to believe. And the woman, Sarah, her voice was smooth, confident, not the voice of someone tentative or guilty, the voice of someone who felt entitled to my husband, entitled to whatever they were planning. A cold resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach, pushing back the initial wave of nausea and despair. They thought I noticed nothing? They thought I was a complication to be managed, a hurdle to be cleared? They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The idea came to me then, fully formed, audacious, almost absurd. It was born out of the pain, yes, but also out of a sudden, fierce surge of self-preservation and a dark, simmering anger that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I would invite her to dinner, to our home, to the place they discussed so casually, the place I supposedly barely noticed. It was madness. It was perfect. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, not of fear, but of a strange, potent anticipation. I needed to see her, to understand who this woman was, who saw me as a mere inconvenience. I needed to see them together, in my space, under my gaze, and I needed them to underestimate me, to continue believing I was the oblivious wife, the one who noticed nothing. That belief would be their undoing. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. It was late. David would be home soon, wearing his mask of tired respectability. I needed to compose myself, to become, for a little while longer, the woman he thought I was, the woman who noticed nothing, the woman who was easily discarded. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The quiet, preoccupied wife was gone. In her place was someone else, someone who was starting to notice everything. The tension in the air wasn't just from the revelation, it was from the coiled energy building within me. The first move had been made, not by them, but by the universe, handing me that audio file. Now it was my turn. And my move would be unexpected. It would be polite. And it would be devastating. The stage was set. My home, the players, my husband, his mistress, and the wife they thought was blind. Let the dinner party begin. The days following the audio discovery were a blur of forced smiles and carefully constructed normalcy. Every interaction with David felt like a performance. I watched him, really watched him, for the first time in years. I saw the subtle tells, the way his eyes darted away when I asked about his evening, the slight tension in his jaw, the overly enthusiastic agreement to mundane plans. It was like observing a stranger wearing my husband's skin. And the silence from others, that was a betrayal in itself. Had anyone else noticed? Had friends or family seen the cracks I had so desperately ignored? Their silence felt complicit, a passive endorsement of his deceit. It fed into that gnawing feeling of being invisible, of not mattering enough for anyone to intervene, or even to acknowledge the obvious distance growing between us. I started to see how I had been slowly, subtly, erased from the picture. Our joint friends gravitated towards David. My opinions in group settings were often talked over or dismissed with a patronizing smile. Family gatherings became awkward, with David holding court while I faded into the background. The quiet wife. I had given so much to this marriage, to them. I had supported David through career changes, sacrificed my own ambitions for the sake of our shared life, managed our home, our finances, our social calendar. I was the foundation upon which his seemingly successful life was built. And they were discarding me like nothing. The feeling of being replaced wasn't just about Sarah. It was about being replaced in my husband's life, in his thoughts, in his future plans. It was the realization that he had built a parallel existence, one where I had no place, no relevance. And the ease with which he seemed to be doing it was the cruelest cut of all. It wasn't a messy, guilt-ridden affair. It felt calculated, a strategic move to transition from one life to another with minimal disruption to his comfort. The gaslighting had been subtle, insidious. When I'd tentatively brought up his late nights, he'd accused me of being insecure, of not trusting him, of making mountains out of molehills. "You're being paranoid," he'd say, his voice calm, reasonable, making me question my own sanity. "It's just work. You know how demanding my job is." And because I loved him, because I wanted to believe him, I had swallowed the doubt, blamed myself for being needy or suspicious. That's the insidious nature of it. They make you the problem, the one who needs to change, the one who is overreacting, while they are the picture of wronged innocence. The humiliation wasn't just the thought of them together. It was the public face we presented, the happy couple facade, attending events, smiling for photos, while I knew now, the rotten core beneath the polished surface. It was the pity I imagined in the eyes of anyone who might suspect, the whispers I was sure followed me in rooms I left, the feeling of being a fool, of being the last one to know. I remembered countless instances where I had voiced concerns, small doubts, feelings of loneliness within the marriage. They were always met with deflection, irritation, or that practiced patronizing reassurance that left me feeling smaller, more isolated. He had perfected the art of making me feel like my emotions were inconvenient, invalid. "You're too sensitive," he'd say. "You're overthinking things." And I, desperate for his approval, his affection, would retreat, internalize the blame, try to be less sensitive, less needy. The silence of those around me was deafening. My own family, geographically distant, relied on my curated updates, the happy family photos, the cheerful anecdotes. I couldn't bring myself to shatter that image, to admit the crumbling reality of my life. His family, they adored David. He was the golden child. Any hint of criticism towards him was met with fierce, protective loyalty. I had learned long ago that my place in their eyes was contingent on my role as the supportive, uncomplaining wife. To voice my pain would be to invite their disapproval, their judgment. So I stayed silent, trapped by my own fear and their expectations. The words from the audio file burned in my mind. "She barely notices anything anymore." It wasn't just an observation. It was a strategy. He needed me to be oblivious so he could execute his plan, whatever it was. And Sarah, the other woman, was clearly a willing participant, perhaps even an instigator. The thought of her, laughing about my supposed ignorance, fueled the fire that had started in my gut. I had given them everything: my youth, my energy, my dreams, my financial contributions to our shared life, my unwavering loyalty. I had built a home, a life, a sense of stability for both of us, and they were ready to simply discard me, like a worn-out coat, no longer needed, no longer fashionable. The pain of that realization was physical, a sharp ache in my chest. It was the pain of fundamental betrayal, of having the very foundation of your life crumble beneath your feet. But beneath the pain, the anger solidified. It wasn't a wild, destructive rage, not yet. It was cold, focused. They saw me as weak, as oblivious. They saw me as a complication to be managed. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea of the strength that lay dormant beneath the surface of the quiet wife. They had pushed me to the edge, stripped away my sense of security, my identity within the marriage. And in doing so, they had inadvertently freed me from the need to be the person they wanted me to be, the person I had tried so hard to be for 15 years. The tension in the house was a palpable thing, thick and heavy. David moved through our shared spaces like a ghost, his presence a constant reminder of the secret he held. I maintained the facade, the pleasant wife, the one who noticed nothing. But behind my eyes, a storm was gathering. I was watching, listening, planning. The dinner invitation wasn't just a moment of confrontation, it was the first carefully placed piece on a chessboard. They thought they were playing checkers, making simple, obvious moves. I was playing chess, and I was already several moves ahead. The feeling of power, small but potent, began to stir within me. They had underestimated me. That was their first and most significant mistake. The decision to invite Sarah to dinner wasn't impulsive, not really. It felt like the only logical next step in a twisted game I hadn't asked to play. But it wasn't about screaming, crying, or throwing things. That would have been too easy for them to dismiss, to control. No, this needed to be different. It needed to be calculated. The pain was still there, a dull ache that never truly subsided, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed, hardening into a steely resolve. The emotional explosion they might have expected never came. Instead, there was a chilling calm. My mind, usually cluttered with the mundane details of daily life, became sharp, focused. I started thinking like a strategist. What did I know? What did I need to know? The audio file was a start, but it was just a glimpse. I needed more. I needed proof, leverage, and I needed to understand the full scope of their plan. "It's all falling into place," David had whispered. What was falling into place? My first step was quiet, almost imperceptible. I started paying attention to details I had previously ignored. David's work calendar, left open on his laptop. His phone, when he left it unattended for a few seconds. I wasn't looking for steamy messages. I was looking for patterns, for names, for financial transactions. I found emails between David and Sarah that weren't overtly romantic, but discussed future plans, investments, and restructuring. Restructuring what? Our lives? His company? Something clicked into place. Sarah wasn't just a mistress. She was involved in something professional, something that likely intertwined with David's career, maybe even his finances. This wasn't just about sex. It was about power, money, and a shared agenda that excluded me entirely. I remembered a conversation months ago that had seemed innocuous at the time. David had mentioned a new colleague, very sharp, very ambitious, who was helping him with a complex project. Sarah. He had introduced her briefly at a company event, a fleeting handshake, a polite smile. I had thought nothing of it. Now the memory felt sinister. The hidden twists began to reveal themselves not through dramatic discovery, but through patient, meticulous observation. I noticed a series of large transfers from our joint savings account. Not huge enough to trigger immediate alarm, but significant over time, labeled vaguely as business expenses. I cross-referenced dates with David's calendar. Meetings with lawyers, meetings with financial advisors. Not our lawyers, not our financial advisors. His, and presumably hers. I also remembered something else, something I had done years ago, almost on a whim. When David's company was just starting out, struggling, I had used a small inheritance from my grandmother to help him secure a crucial early investment. It wasn't a loan. It was an investment in him, in our future. We had signed a simple agreement then, drafted by a junior lawyer friend, outlining my contribution and a small percentage point of future profits, mainly as a symbolic gesture of partnership. We had both forgotten about it, lost in the shuffle of building the business, raising a family. But I hadn't completely forgotten. That document, tucked away in a dusty box of old papers, suddenly felt like a lifeline. A forgotten seed I had planted years ago, now ready to sprout at the most opportune moment. I needed an ally, someone outside this toxic circle. I thought of Maria, a former colleague from my brief pre-marriage career in financial analysis. Sharp, discreet, and with a healthy skepticism for corporate types like David. I reached out, framing it initially as needing advice on a personal investment. Slowly, cautiously, I shared pieces of what I was uncovering. Maria listened, her initial polite interest turning into focused concern. She had connections, access to databases, knowledge of corporate structures and legal loopholes I lacked. She became my silent partner, my strategic advisor. She helped me trace the money transfers, identify the lawyers David was meeting with, and understand the potential implications of his restructuring plans. It became clear they weren't just planning a future together. They were planning to leverage his position, potentially using or discarding assets, including me, to maximize their gain. The psychological shift was profound. The woman who had felt invisible, discarded, was now a conductor, orchestrating a complex symphony of information gathering and strategic planning. The pain was still the fuel, but the engine was cold, logical calculation. I practiced my poker face in the mirror. I rehearsed conversations with David, maintaining the facade of the unsuspecting wife. It required an immense amount of control, of suppressing the urge to scream, to confront him. But I knew that confrontation would only alert him, giving him time to cover his tracks. My strength lay in his underestimation of me. The dinner invitation was sent. A casual text to David. "How about we have Sarah over for dinner next week? You've mentioned her helping you so much, I'd love to thank her properly." He paused for a long time before replying, a pause that spoke volumes. Then a slightly too eager, "Great idea, honey. I'll ask her." Sarah accepted, her reply equally casual, masking, I was sure, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even arrogance. They probably thought I was trying to be the gracious, welcoming wife, completely oblivious. Let them think that. While they were making dinner plans, I was working with Maria, building my case, gathering the financial records, locating that old investment agreement, researching Sarah's professional history. Turns out Sarah wasn't just a colleague. She had a history of moving between companies, always aligning herself with rising executives who later faced complications, legal complications, financial investigations. A pattern was emerging, and I was determined not to be another casualty in her ascent. I felt a strange sense of detachment during this phase. It was as if I was observing myself from a distance, this calm, calculating woman who was meticulously dismantling her own life in order to rebuild it. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose. They had tried to make me a victim. I refused. I was becoming the architect of my own justice. The pieces were in place. The forgotten investment, the hidden transfers, the pattern of Sarah's past, Maria's expertise, and the dinner, the final piece of the setup. They were walking into my trap, and they had no idea. The anticipation was a tight coil in my chest. The game was about to enter its most critical phase. The night of the dinner arrived cloaked in a false sense of domestic tranquility. I had set the table meticulously, lit candles, put on some soft music. The house smelled of the roast chicken I had prepared, a classic, comforting scent that felt utterly incongruous with the tension humming beneath the surface. David was nervous, fidgeting, overly solicitous. Sarah arrived promptly, dressed impeccably, a picture of professional polish and casual charm. She offered a polite smile, her eyes scanning the room with an almost proprietary air that made my skin crawl. The initial conversation was stilted, polite. We talked about work, about the weather, about anything and everything that wasn't the elephant in the room, the one I had invited to sit at my table. I played the part of the gracious hostess, asking Sarah about her background, her interests. I even managed a few lighthearted jokes, injecting a touch of dark humor that went right over David's head, but earned a sharp, assessing glance from Sarah. She was smart. I gave her that. She sensed something was off, but she couldn't pinpoint it. She probably attributed it to a wife's vague unease about her husband's attractive colleague. Good. Let her underestimate me. Dinner was served. The clinking of silverware against ceramic felt unnaturally loud. David tried to steer the conversation towards his recent successes, puffing up his chest slightly. Sarah chimed in, praising his vision, his leadership. They were a united front, a team. Watching them, the casual intimacy in their shared glances, the way they finished each other's sentences, was a fresh wave of pain, but I wrote it, using it to sharpen my focus. As dessert plates were cleared, I took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. "David," I began, my voice calm, clear, cutting through the polite chatter. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Sarah," I continued, turning to her, "it's been so lovely having you over. David speaks so highly of you." Sarah smiled, a practiced, professional smile. "He's a wonderful colleague," she replied smoothly. "Yes," I said, my gaze steady, meeting hers. "He is. And he's also a wonderful husband." Or so I thought. The air in the room thickened instantly. David froze, his fork clattering onto his plate. Sarah's smile faltered, replaced by a look of guarded confusion. "What are you talking about?" David stammered, his face paling. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm talking about project notes, Tuesday," I said, my voice still calm, but with an edge of steel. "The audio file you uploaded to our shared drive, David. Late Monday night." David's eyes widened in disbelief. He glanced at Sarah, who looked equally stunned. They hadn't anticipated this. "Not here. Not now. And I'm talking," I continued, pulling a sleek tablet from beside my chair, "about the transfers from our joint account, the business expenses that coincide with meetings with lawyers and financial advisors I've never met." I swiped the screen, displaying a spreadsheet Maria had helped me compile, detailing the dates, amounts, and recipients of the transfers. Sarah leaned forward, her initial shock giving way to a flicker of anger. "You've been going through his private files?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Our shared files," I corrected, my gaze unwavering, "and our joint account, which makes it my business." I paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. David was speechless, his mouth slightly open. Then, I delivered the final blow, the one they couldn't have possibly prepared for. And while we're discussing finances and shared futures, I said, opening another document on the tablet, I thought it would be prudent to remind David of this. I turned the screen towards them. It was a scanned copy of the old investment agreement, the one from years ago. My initial investment in David's company, I explained, my voice resonating with quiet power, with a clause, however small, granting me a percentage of future profits, a clause that, according to the company's recent valuation, which, incidentally, I also had looked into, amounts to a rather significant sum now. David's face was ashen. He stared at the document as if it were a ghost from the past, come back to haunt him. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Her eyes narrowed, a cold fury replacing the earlier shock. "That old thing? That's worthless now," she scoffed. "Actually," I said, a small, grim smile touching my lips, "Maria, a brilliant financial analyst and a very good friend, assures me it's quite legally binding, especially considering the restructuring plans you two seem to have been discussing. Plans that, I suspect, involved minimizing my share or eliminating it entirely." I held up another document, a printout of the emails between David and Sarah, the ones discussing future plans and restructuring. The subtext was now blindingly obvious. They weren't just having an affair. They were plotting a financial takeover, using their relationship to consolidate power and wealth, leaving me with nothing. The impact was immediate and devastating. David buried his face in his hands, a sound escaping his lips that was somewhere between a groan and a sob. Sarah, however, was all sharp edges and defensive anger. "You set us up," she hissed, glaring at me. "You set yourselves up," I replied calmly. "By underestimating me, by thinking I was blind, deaf, and stupid." I stood up, the tablet still in my hand. "This isn't a negotiation," I stated, my voice firm. "This is a statement of fact. I know what you've been doing. I know what you were planning. And I have the means to ensure that your plan doesn't unfold quite the way you envisioned." I laid out the consequences, not with threats, but with simple, undeniable facts. Legal action based on the investment agreement and the questionable transfers. Exposure of their affair within David's professional circle, jeopardizing his reputation and career. Potential investigations into their financial dealings. The consequences were social, legal, and financial. Precisely the areas where they were most vulnerable, where they had built their carefully constructed world. David was a broken man across the table, his carefully constructed facade shattered. Sarah, however, was already calculating, her eyes darting between me and the documents, assessing the damage, looking for an angle. But there was no angle. I had closed them all. "You have a choice," I said, my voice softening slightly, not out of pity, but out of a weary sense of finality. "We can do this cleanly, or we can do this messily. But make no mistake, the outcome will be the same. Your plan is over, and you will both face the consequences." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by David's ragged breathing. The candles flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. The roast chicken sat untouched on the plates. The dinner party was over. The reckoning had begun. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of power. Not over them, but over my own life. I had taken back control. The feeling was intoxicating. The immediate aftermath of the dinner was a chaotic blur of hushed arguments, frantic phone calls, and the eventual, awkward departure of Sarah into the night. David was a wreck, alternating between pathetic apologies and angry accusations. I remained calm, detached. The emotional storm had passed, replaced by a quiet, resolute peace. The pain was still a part of me, a scar that would likely never fully fade, but it no longer dictated my actions. I had faced the betrayal head-on, not with tears, but with strategy, and I had emerged, if not unscathed, then certainly not defeated. The legal and financial disentanglement was messy, protracted, but ultimately on my terms. The investment agreement proved to be the linchpin, giving me significant leverage. The questionable financial transfers led to uncomfortable questions for David and Sarah, both professionally and legally. There were settlements, asset divisions, and the quiet, undeniable collapse of the future they had planned together. David's career suffered a significant blow, his reputation tarnished. Sarah, too, faced professional repercussions, her carefully built network fracturing. They paid a price, not just financially but socially, professionally. The universe, it seemed, had a way of balancing the scales, often with a brutal efficiency. Our home, the stage for that final pivotal dinner, became a place of transition. It no longer felt like our home, but my home, a space I needed to reclaim, to redefine. I started making small changes, painting walls, rearranging furniture, shedding the layers of a life that had been built on a foundation of sand. Each change felt like a step towards reclaiming myself, towards building a future solely on my own terms. There were moments of sadness, of course. Looking at old photographs, remembering shared laughter, shared dreams. The grief for the marriage I thought I had was real. It wasn't just about David. It was about the loss of a shared history, the shattering of a fundamental trust. But the sadness was tempered by a fierce pride in my own resilience, my own strength. I hadn't crumbled. I hadn't been discarded. I had fought back, not with violence but with intellect and quiet determination. My relationship with David became a distant, civil arrangement, focused solely on the practicalities of separation. The emotional connection had been severed that night at the dinner table. He was no longer the man I had loved, but a stranger who had betrayed me. Sarah disappeared from my life, a brief destructive force of nature that had, paradoxically, cleared the path for new growth. Maria remained a steadfast friend, her support invaluable. Through her, I reconnected with my own professional aspirations, the ones I had set aside years ago. The financial settlement, combined with my own skills and newfound determination, opened doors I hadn't thought possible. I started building something new, something entirely my own. The feeling of being invisible, of being underestimated, still lingered sometimes, a phantom ache. But now, it served as a reminder of how far I had come, of the power that lay dormant within me. I had learned that true strength wasn't about never falling, but about getting back up, about refusing to be defined by someone else's betrayal. Life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, moments of doubt. The scars were real, but there was also a profound sense of peace, a quiet confidence that came from knowing I had faced the worst and survived, even thrived. I was no longer the quiet wife who noticed nothing. I was the woman who had seen everything, understood everything, and acted. And as I stood in my home, now truly my home, looking out at the sunrise, a single thought solidified, a final, resonant truth born from the ashes of betrayal. They thought they could break me. Instead, they set me free.